Um, Welcome, SciCommers, to our November Mentor Chat. Today, we are joined by Dan Pomeroy from the Scientific Citizen Initiative, which is a lab for innovative learning experiences to promote meaningful interactions between science and society. Um, Prior to developing the Scientific Citizen Initiative, Dan developed the MIT Policy Lab at the Center for International Studies. He has also, sorry, it's a very long list. He's also participated in Boston University's Broadening Experiences in Scientific Training program and the National Advisory Board of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Um, he's also been a postdoctoral fellow at the National Academy of Sciences and as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the Office of Senator Edward J. Markey. Um, and so Dan has a full presentation for us, so I don't want to take up any more of his time. I want all of you to know that if you've got questions during the presentation, feel free to add them in the chat. I think Dan is also okay with you verbally interrupting if you are comfortable with that. And with that, I will give the floor over to Dan.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Excited to talk to you all today. I am very much a fan of verbal interruptions. Also, if somebody puts something in the chat, can you just let me know? Because one thing I'm not good at is monitoring the chat and talking at the same time. So, but please interrupt. I hope the presentation is a conversation, even though I'll use slides because I am a physicist by training and rely on that crutch. Also, I invite you all to the best of your ability to turn your cameras on. It would be lovely to be talking to faces. Just on my end, it makes it more interactive. Cool. So I have a presentation that I will now share. Can you all see this? Yeah, thumbs up. Awesome. Cool. So yeah, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about the Scientific Citizenship Initiative and the programming that we do. And then I would love to get your questions, feedback, et cetera, et cetera. So just to jump right into it, I'm sure many of you know that our societal challenges these days really require scientists to be engaging with society, whether it's addressing the challenges of climate change, preparing for future pandemics, or understanding how AI will impact the world. We need scientists to be engaged in the decision-making process and to do it in ways that promote a more equitable and just world. In addition to that, academia faces some major challenges. You probably all saw some politicization, wow, I can't speak today, of science at some congressional hearings about almost a year ago now. But even more concerningly, there's a declining level of public trust in science. It's not I mean, to some degree, it is stronger by one sort of political leaning than the other, but it is true across both categories. And beyond that, or because of that, and many other things, stakeholders are calling for a change in the way we do STEM education. Coming from Harvard, we saw, a big student demand to have training opportunities on how to effectively engage with society. We've seen funders like the NIH and NSF requiring more programs that address public engagement, ethics, and the broader impacts of the scientific work itself. We've seen academic leadership like the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology call for public engagement to be part of what it means to be a scientist. And most importantly, the public is calling for this. So the majority or the vast majority of individuals think that scientists should consider it part of their job to inform the public about their research and its impact on society. This is true across both or across the full political spectrum, and also believe it's important for scientists to inform elected officials about their work. So with all that said, we believe in response to this, we've seen a growing civic science movement. There are many different organizations who are working to address these challenges. These are just a handful of the ones we interact with. But I think, yeah, it's important to know that groups like this and others are really part of a larger community that cares about these issues and cares about connecting science and society. Um, uh, there's a thing in the chat. There seems to be a general trend towards the, yes. So yeah, that is true that there is a general sort of decline in trust in institutions across the board. Yeah. And so I think all institutions have work to do in terms of regaining public trust. And coming from the science world, that's the piece that I focus on. But it is true that this is a general problem. Um, great. So in response to all of this, the Scientific Citizenship Initiative has become an organization that supports a growing civic science movement to make science more societally engaged and impactful. We are working with scientists, policymakers, and STEM organizations to provide training opportunities for scientists. This is, as of this summer, we are an independent nonprofit with this mission, but we were actually created at Harvard in 2018. So I'm going to give you the backstory of how we were created, what we developed at Harvard, and then tell you about what we're doing now moving forward as an independent nonprofit. Um, so this is a timeline which has way too much information on it. But in 2018, there was a large dinner event held at Harvard, organized by our founding faculty director, Angela DePace. It brought together the dean of Harvard Medical School, the director of the Broad Institute, many different educators across the Boston area, students. I was there because of my work at MIT. And it really was a kind of brainstorm about, what do we need to do to address the fact that, solving societal challenges requires scientists to be working together with community. There was a 2-year kind of incubation period. I was on the leadership team that sort of set up the structure and got some of the funding to launch the program. And then in 2020, we formally launched the program itself and began developing a number of training materials, which I'm going to go into in detail in a minute. In 2022, both myself and my co-director, Natalie, took over the organization. And in 2024, we are now going independent. Yeah, so our flagship program. So at Harvard, we developed programs in 2 general categories. So we have classroom style learning, and all of this is simulation based, interactive, mostly workshop style courses that are designed for students, primarily STEM graduate students, to be able to do while maintaining academic responsibilities. So they're usually done in like 2-3 hour sessions, that kind of thing. Although we had 1 2-credit course, which I'll tell you about. We paired all the classroom learning with an experiential learning program called the Civic Science Clinic. And this was a part-time summer fellowship program that put STEM graduate students in service to society, either in the Massachusetts State House or in Boston-based community organizations. And so to go into more detail, so on the classroom side, this is a simulation example of just one of our simulations and just the first decision point in the simulation. So the point of this is we put students in kind of challenging ethical decision spaces and ask them to make decisions, and then there's actual outcomes from these. So in this simulation, the students are founders of a biotech startup, and this startup has produced a gene editing technology that can alter entire ecosystems and eliminate invasive species. They're called gene drives. They really exist. And the first decision point they have to make is how to deploy this new technology. They're presented with 3 options. One is that the island nation of New Ireland provided a lot of the funding to create this technology. There were environmental organizations there who wanted to eliminate a rat population that was threatening native species of birds. But over the time that the technology was being developed, the public support started to wane because of concerns about the risk of deploying this kind of new technology. You think that you can, with some discussions and some lobbying with the decision makers there, still go forward with the original plan to deploy the technology there. However, in the meantime, you received an offer from the dictator of Equatorial Guinea, who really wants to use the technology to eliminate rats that pose a public health risk. They're destroying crops and causing, loss of life. In this case, the general population is opposed both on the grounds of worried about risk, but also on religious grounds related to sort of changing the role of humans and changing ecosystems. And then the third option is to conduct additional research. So spend 2 more years trying to address people's safety concerns to sort of move public opinion in that way. If we were in person, I would have you kind of pair off and discuss this for a minute and see what conclusion you come to. Yeah, it doesn't work so well over Zoom. I'll just go forward with it. But maybe take a second and think about what you would do and throw it in the chat just as a poll. How about that? Zoom's not super conducive to interactive stuff without a lot of pre-planning. Yeah, the breakout groups would take a while. Let's just throw in the chat what you all think you would do. More research. More research, more research. Okay. Yes, so typically scientists choose more research. That is our default mode in what we write into every grant. More research needed. So I'm going to show you the outcomes of the more research option because I somehow guessed that that's where we would go. Talk to various people in focus groups and listening sessions. Yes, unfortunately, we constrain people to the decisions, the options. Which I could explain why in Q&A if you want. More research here. Okay, so if you choose more research, we have both high probability and low probability outcomes. These are not meant to be completely realistic, but just to give a sense that there are real outcomes to this, which then are discussed in the debrief. So high probability is that you confirm the technology is safe. You've done lots of work already. But in the meantime, New Ireland lost $7.7 billion in GDP growth and 2 endangered bird species were driven to extinction. At the same time, Equatorial Guinea forewent 4.8 billion in GDP growth and 22,000 people died who could have otherwise been safe from malnutrition and diseases. The stock of your company fell by $10 a share because of the delays. Low probability is that there was a defect in the technology that was discovered, which could have led to modifications spreading to native rat populations and causing their extinction. Economists estimate that the total cost of a faulty release would run over 10 billion. However, New Ireland and Equatorial Guinea still experience the outcomes above, right? So and then the learning aspect of this then comes in a debrief conversation, which is more about why you chose this and sort of making scientists aware that they are in reasoning this out themselves using various frameworks to make decisions. So in this case, choosing additional research usually is, you're weighing the, the framework for this is called the precautionary principle, where you value precaution and proving safety above technological advancement. There's other decision-making frameworks that say you should lean towards technological advancement and deploying technology because of the potential benefits, and then address sort of, address the potential negative outcomes afterwards. I'm not explaining this super well. Curriculum is not my side of the co-directing, but anyway, you get the point. So we put difficult scenarios in front of students, force them to make decisions, hopefully realize that there's decisions are a bit more complex than they thought, and then use their decision-making sort of thought process to show them that there are sort of ethical frameworks for thinking about these things that can be applied in other situations. Awesome. So that's our simulation stuff. We also have a science communication course that turns science communication on its head. Instead of sort of teaching how to take jargon out of your speech, we really focus on communicating through active listening with the purpose of building dialogue with the people you're communicating with in a way that builds trust and leads to actual meaningful communication. And so this is the 2-credit course, and there's a variety of exercises that they do in this course. One example is this one, talking about 2 different types of listening: the vicious cycle and the constructive cycle. In the vicious cycle, you listen for the purposes of sort of defending your point of view and ask questions that really are designed to make your point. When you do that, you trigger somebody's sort of natural reaction to defend their point of view, and it just goes around in circles, usually without making much progress. If you've ever engaged in sort of an online debate with somebody, I'm sure that you've experienced this type of communication, or maybe just in your personal life. And so we put students through actual exercises where they do that kind of conversation and sort of feel kind of their emotional reaction to that, and observe, how productive they felt like the conversation would go. And then we teach them about this constructive cycle, which is about listening to truly understand the values and emotions of the person that you're talking to, reflecting on what you heard, and responding with a way that assumes good intention and asking open and honest questions. And then they do this kind of exercise and reflect on how that conversation felt in a way that allows students to kind of embody the actual sort of effects of doing this versus just what I'm doing now, which is showing you it on a slide. That's our classroom style learning that we made at Harvard. Like I said, and students loved it. This course changed a student's life and the way they think about research and how it can serve society. So I'm going to sprinkle some impact things along in this. I was told I could recycle a talk, so this is a talk that I gave to a different group of people that, well, anyway, I don't need to sell you guys on this, but there's impact statements throughout. And here's one now. So we evaluated the educational impact of our programming after running it for, I would say 3 years. There's like a year of development and then 3 years of running. And you can see that across the various dimensions that we measure, so understanding of ethical reasoning, so these histograms are like before and after, and you can see clear shifts to the right in all of these. So ask them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do they understand this? Increases across all of the things that we've measured. So understanding of ethical reasoning, ability to communicate ethical reasoning, ability to communicate with diverse audiences, and ability to identify stakeholder perspectives. These are just a few examples, but these are some of the core learning outcomes that we hope will happen in all of our courses. Yeah, okay. And then we paired all of that with experiential learning. As I mentioned, we had a summer fellowship program called the Civic Science Clinic. The purpose was to give students an opportunity to work in service to society, which was part of their demand, but also to reinforce the learning of our classroom. It was 10 weeks for 20 hours a week. We had an orientation, ongoing mentorship throughout. And this, like all of our other activities, were designed so that students could participate while still maintaining all of their academic responsibilities. This is because, as you all probably know, there is not a lot of opportunity while you're still in school to have this kind of career development experience, and especially not a paid version of it. That probably should be in here somewhere. So yes, students were paid a stipend. And so typically, you get this experience through groups like this, extracurricular type volunteer things. And we wanted to create something that was more formal to provide that experience and to benefit our partners. So we did it through we started with a 3-year pilot of a state house fellowship program that just put students in the state house because that's more of a straightforward thing that people are familiar with. And then we did a year-long listening tour to think about how we extend that to community organizations, and identified 3 partners in that, one being Fenway Health, which is a community health center in Boston. Another is Eastie Farm, which is a community farming organization in East Boston. And then last is Essential Partners, which is a nonprofit that works to create dialogue across differences and actually help develop the communication course that I mentioned. Yeah, so some examples. So in 2020, we had a fellow who, as you imagine, in 2020, most of the State House was really concerned about COVID, and most of them wanted scientists to help them understand it. So she worked to interpret all of the very rapidly changing data and draft responses, et cetera. All of our, representative and senators who worked with our fellows were very impressed and had great things to say. Kayla talked about this really solidifying her interest in science policy career, which is evident by the fact that she now works at the National Institutes of Health in the immediate office of the director. So we show, not only do students like this and State House like this, but it actually has real impact on students' careers and trajectories. In the case of the community engagement, we only ran this for 1 year in 2023, but have, similar experience where students worked in this case. This is the Eastie Farm example. Layla helped to write grants and create educational workshops and policy workshops for the students who were at the farm. They really appreciated bringing her expertise related to energy. But more importantly, at the end, she was thinking about community-based science, and told us, I guess that's not the quote we used here, but that she really wanted to bring back the idea of public engagement into her research, going back from the fellowship. And her research is in fusion energy. So not the place you might immediately expect community engagement, but this is the exact type of thing that the civic science movement more generally wants, is for scientists to be engaging with the world, engaging with community, and thinking about how the technology they're developing addresses problems and responds to community concerns. I feel like I am very much racing through this, so but I guess we'll press on if there are no questions so far. So that's all the stuff we developed at Harvard. That actually might be a good pausing point if you have questions about that before I talk about where we're going from there. Yeah, I see a hand up.
Hi there. My name is Daniel Pimentel. Currently an assistant professor at the University of Alabama in science education, and I do work in science media literacy and civic science education. So it's really cool to see your materials. My question is, have you considered expanding into secondary science education, like grades 7 through 12, with some of your curriculum materials? And maybe that's where you're going to discuss next.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something we'd be open to. I think that, and we've talked about kind of advising on projects related to that with partners. There was one, so we've been written into grants to provide some advising on that. Our personal background, so myself and Natalie, come from sort of STEM PhD world, and we think that that is where a lot of the focus is from our position, and where our expertise is after 4 years at Harvard. We also identified STEM graduate students in particular as the highest kind of leverage point in the fight for cultural change in sort of science, because they're a population that's still open-minded to the idea that we might need to do science differently, and they will set the future culture of academia. So that said, I think our programs could be adapted to, a large variety of contexts. But everything we did at Harvard was really focused on the STEM graduate students as like the high impact potential audience that we sort of most naturally fit in with. Does that make sense? Yeah. Other questions? And I'll get into a bit more on that in a second, but other questions about what we've done, the history. Okay, so now let's talk about where we're going. So as I said in the beginning, we started off as a program that really thought about how do we develop new approaches to STEM graduate education. We are now an independent nonprofit that thinks about how can we support this growing civic science movement and how can we use our expertise and our experience to help partners and other people who are trying to address this problem do it more effectively and efficiently. We're thinking about that right now in terms of 3 phases. So our first phase is really broadening the reach of our existing programs. So we developed a lot of really cool stuff at Harvard that I just told you about. It was really great to work with all the very very lovely Harvard students, but we think that this kind of material could be helpful to a broader audience, and we think that by becoming an independent organization, we can make our training more broadly accessible and give opportunities to students who may not have them because they're not at institutions that that have the resources of Harvard. Doing that in a few different ways. So turning more of our material into open access training modules and guides. So if you go to our website, we already have one open access online training module that you can do yourself. It's kind of a choose your own adventure where you make difficult decisions about what research you pursue as a faculty member. And it also comes with accompanying teaching guide. So if an instructor wanted to take and run that simulation in their course, as I was kind of alluding to and maybe not explaining super well before, like the debrief of what happens after the simulation is really important because you really need to explain and contextualize like how the students' decision-making processes fit into existing frameworks of ethics and et cetera. So anyway, online module that you can do yourself or take into a classroom. Also teaching guides, so that gene jive simulation that I showed, we have teaching guides for that an instructor could take and run themselves. It also includes, how to do the debrief, et cetera. We want to convert more of our training into that kind of format. We also want to open our fellowships to all scientists. And so I am working right now to see if we can find some funding to continue to run the Civic Science Clinic and make it sort of an open application to STEM graduate students. Probably would have to start in the Boston area given the geography of what we're doing, but eventually expand beyond that. Because again, we did these programs with Harvard students, actually MIT students joined in too, but it'd really be great to offer these opportunities to less well-resourced schools that don't have the funding to do it. So working to raise funding for that. Also did receive some funding, which I'll talk about on potentially the next slide. And then supporting our partners in civic science efforts. So kind of to Daniel's point, part of what we're doing is really thinking about how we use our expertise to help organizations that are developing programming in this vein to do it more effectively and efficiently is the way we pitch it. So for example, the Broad Institute was thinking about how do you incorporate health equity throughout the research process at the Broad Institute? And we worked with them using kind of our experience to develop a strategic plan for how you might move the needle on these issues. We've also talked to Boston University, providing some feedback into their new graduate certificate on civic science communications. And so we really want to be helpful to the broader community and using our expertise and experience for people who are new to the space to help them do it better. So that could also be thought about how you do it in different educational contexts. So that's kind of phase one. Phase two is once we've gotten our stuff out in the world, we want to help train other people to create similar materials. So we want to create a national network of civic science educators, and really think about something like a fellowship program that brings instructors into SCI. We work with them to develop a new simulation, for example, and in the process train them on how to make this training material themselves. So kind of a train the trainer that allows the work to kind of spread naturally by people building out their own training and using kind of our pedagogical processes to do that. Also scaling our experiential learning programs, hopefully making our civic science clinic go beyond just Massachusetts. And then in the long term, we want to be a global repository for civic science education. As science continues to evolve and the challenges we face as society change, we're going to constantly need this type of training and constantly need to be updating what exists. And we think having an independent organization that holds this, knowledge can help others whenever people need to sort of start wading into this space. That's the 3-point thing, and then I'll give a quick plug. So we did just get our first award as an independent nonprofit to, it was a planning grant to create a Massachusetts Science and Technology Policy Fellowship that would be a post-graduate year-long full-time program that would place scientists in the Massachusetts State House to be policy advisors to members of the State House. It builds obviously on the science policy portion of our civic science clinic, which taking it from a part-time summer program for current students to a full-time postdoctoral program for a year. And I'm spending the next year trying to build that out. And we'll have questions for you all about that. And yeah, so I think that's the formal presentation. Check out our website, sign up for our newsletter. The sign-up's in the bottom right-hand corner of the website. We need to figure out how to get it in other places too. But yeah, sign up for our newsletter. We don't send it out very often, but we'd love to keep in touch and keep you informed. And also I'd love to answer questions.
Thanks, Dan. I will open the floor if anyone else has a question they would like to ask first. Otherwise,
Actually, I'll go back. So on my question for you all, while I sort of have the floor. So for this, one of the things that is part of the process is obviously our fellowship program. We had a process of inclusive recruitment process at Harvard that was designed to make sure that we had diverse cohorts of students. I now need to expand that to the broader Massachusetts community. So if you know any groups that I should be engaging with, like the SciCommers, could you put them in the chat so I can add them to the list? Because I need to go out, engage, understand what these various communities need, and make sure that the program that we create really addresses the needs of the community. For now, probably mostly Boston-based, well, or national, really, because anybody will be able to apply. Yeah, I take that back. Anyone will be able to apply to the program. So any networks, especially networks that target underrepresented sort of identities in STEM would be really great for me to be able to connect with and understand sort of the needs of the community and make sure that we incorporate that in this planning process. So that's my one request from you all. Any groups I should connect with, please put them in the chat. I'll stop talking now. And yeah.
thank you. So we do have a question from the chat. Do you think you could talk a little bit about what challenges you and your colleagues are thinking that you'll be facing with changes in science funding that may occur shortly?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I would start by turning it, I don't know if you can unmute Annalyn, but if you could explain what your thinking is on why science funding is changing and just, yeah, explain the context of that. Maybe you can't unmute. Okay, so I'm just making a note of this thing. So, okay, I assume you're talking about the change in administration, and I think it's important. There's a lot of headlines, right? It's important to try to contextualize what is meaningful and what is not. Some of it we won't know how meaningful it is going forward. The one that is sort of the bane of my existence right now is this Department of Government Efficiency, or yeah, which I imagine might be part of the motivation for this question. And just like for some context on that, there is no Department of Government Efficiency. That's just not a thing. What Trump can actually do is create like a committee that develops recommendations for all the money that should be cut out of government. The president doesn't have the power to reduce budgets. They have the power to propose to Congress that budgets get reduced. And so while I imagine there is potential for cuts, the I believe, and I should look back at the numbers, like the cuts in the first, well, I know for sure that the cuts that the Trump administration proposed in the first time around were not what Congress decided to do, right? And so it's important, yeah, just for that kind of context, president proposes budget, Congress decides budget, Congress can tell president, you know, you need to do this program, you need to fund this thing, et cetera. And there is generally bipartisan support for funding of science, though it becomes more partisan by sort of topic, right? Anyway, it's a long answer to just say like people, there's a lot to be worried about, and it's important to like prioritize what we're worried about. So we have not thought a lot about this personally, especially now that we're not in an academic context. I think about it a lot as a former political organizer. For context, I ran campaign offices in the year leading up to the 2008 elections full time. I left my PhD program to do it. I spent the week before this election in Wisconsin knocking on hundreds and hundreds of doors. And so I acutely feel the anxiety that many people are feeling, but I do think it's important to sort of understand where the anxiety is best placed. Sorry, that's just a rant that really has more to do with my friends than maybe you all. To what degree are the people who do this for a living worried about this? Yeah, I mean, people are going to be worried. And then it just comes down to like, will Congress make cuts? And if so, where? And in 2016, there was, you know, or 2017, I guess, a huge effort by the scientific community to ensure that scientific budgets were not cut. I actually helped run an op-ed campaign that was in response to the Trump administration's budget announcement, where I helped students write op-eds for their local hometown newspaper explaining why science funding is important. And so I think it's certainly, it's an area that I believe scientists should be engaging in. And I could probably give a whole separate talk about that. In fact, I did make a talk in 2016 that was engaged, or 2017, engaging with Congress beyond phone calls and emails. And I think if the scientific community engages, you can actually prevent a lot of that, because again, it's Congress that decides that. And if you make a case to them for why scientific funding is important, it doesn't matter what the president wants to do. And I don't think among the cuts, I mean, it matters in the sense that he has some negotiating leverage to veto the budget, but I don't think science funding is going to be the thing that would lead to a veto of the budget. I think it's things like, well, I don't know, potentially like Department of Education, which I guess is science adjacent. But anyway, that's my rant on that.
Sort of on that same vein, are there, so some of the programming from the Scientific Citizenship Initiative, are these sort of geared towards people who already have sort of like a base interest and knowledge in sort of civic science and civic engagement, or could people, especially like scientists who are sort of just now coming over into wanting to be more engaged? Could they sort of jump into some of these programs?
Yeah, no, our programs are designed to take people from 0 to something greater than 0. I'm not sure we're going to claim to 100, but yeah, I mean, they were extracurricular, so like only students who cared about this engaged. But there were students from very basic research backgrounds who just knew they cared about this but didn't know how to do it. And so that is definitely the audience that we are aiming for. And also, some of our material has been incorporated into existing classrooms. So in that case, it's students who didn't even necessarily sign up for it, but like we run the workshop, as part of, typical science course, like a required course. So yes, aimed at very general audience, well, aimed generally at STEM PhD students, I would say. But beyond that, yeah, we hope that people who have just a passing interest will join. I have a science policy nano course that really starts from a very basic level of like, what is the role of science in creating public policy? And what are the roles, that both science and personal values, et cetera, play in creating science policy. And that one's also interactive, where in the end, students build to making a pitch for a policy recommendation, which may be relevant in the near term.
So on one of your pillars is like making, oh gosh, what am I saying? Having like a global repository of
Yeah.
educators. Are there also sort of thoughts about like translating the like training programs and modules that you have into different languages?
Oh yeah, that would be great. We've definitely talked about that. We need the expertise to do that. I had or know enough Spanish to brokenly talk to people at the door about voting, which I was very excited to do, but not the ability to fully translate. So that is 100% something we'd be interested in. We would need the funding and expertise to do it. So yes, if you know people interested in that, certainly connect us.
Does anyone else have questions, comments, concerns? Okay. So I guess another. I guess.
I could ask.
Okay.
Okay.
So I have sorry. It's like my questions are like formulating in my mind at the same time, and it's too many of them. To go off of Daniel's question earlier about sort of considering expanding into secondary education, and I'm not sure if Daniel meant like expanding so that the audience is now those secondary students, but I was wondering if you were thinking of maybe like expanding the programming so that what was I saying? I don't remember anymore. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different audiences we could expand to. I guess like we have talked to people about K through 12. We've also talked to people about more postdoc focused type things. Although postdocs had participated in our programs before, I think it'd be great to sort of target faculty at some point and get them on board. That to some degree is our phase 2 educator network. But yeah, and if you check out our the training material we do have on our website, you can see like it's I don't think it's, well, like the gene drive simulation, probably not too far out of reach for like high school students. It probably wouldn't require a ton of translation. Some of the other stuff maybe more so. We have another simulation that's students play the role of nation states in a global decision-making body, making choices about how solar geoengineering will be researched and deployed, which is a technology that we could use to basically block out some of the sun to reduce the global warming of greenhouse gas emissions in a temporary or anyway. So that one's a little bit more complex for maybe high school students, but yeah.
So, and also you were a AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Um, was that did that experience inform sort of the scientific citizen initiative, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, I'm actually going to stop screen share so I can see people's faces better. Um, so yeah, I mean, that program was very like formative in my life. I, after finishing my PhD, didn't really know what I was doing with myself. Like I said, I ran campaign offices for over a year, which made getting a PhD seem easy by comparison. So I went back and finished the program, and then was trying to combine those interests. Working in Congress was a very eye-opening and cool thing. It more directly led into the program that I created at MIT, which was a resource that connected faculty and their research to policymakers across all domains of research and policy, and helped them do strategic planning on how to do effective outreach. But through that, that kind of informed SCI a bit more, because the program at MIT to some degree was like a band-aid on the problem, right? These faculty members had never been trained on what it means to engage with audiences outside of academia, especially policymakers. So it was kind of going sort of one step upstream in the process, right? If this type of training was included, there would be less need for a policy lab type program that trains faculty at that point. So yeah, it's kind of moving upstream in the process, and now we're moving even more upstream as we think about partnering with institutions that are developing these programs, and just thinking about how that can broaden our impact beyond just developing our own trainings at Harvard.
Sorry, I have a cat and he's
It's okay.
doing too much. And so I guess with in light of, not but like uh possible coming changes to federal leadership, um and how that, I don't know, how that may impact sort of the public's trust or mistrust within science. um is Have you guys thought of anything new, or has that changed any decision making of sort of programming and goals going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't yet because it's only been a week that we've known. It was not the outcome that I was hoping for. And so we haven't really sort of had time to process that and how it would impact our work. I am, sort of gears are turning in my brain about like what could I do this time around. So like last time I created this talk, I said engaging with Congress beyond phone calls and emails, because people felt like, they were calling every day, and like what more could they do? Um, Became very popular, gave that talk many times. This time I'm thinking about, and I haven't fully worked it out, but like something about, you know, this is like, I'm thinking about controversial titles to get attention, but like why we should befriend Joe Rogan and how to do it. Um, and so like thinking about how we take sort of SCI's active listening stuff and think
Mhm.
about like how you use that as a tool for engaging people you may not sort of completely see eye to eye with, in a way that does build trust. And so, for example, when it comes to like vaccine hesitancy, I was visiting one of my cousins in Texas in the beginning of March of 2020, who, while I was there, found out that her and her husband were sort of vaccine hesitant. Going back to that slide with the two sort of conversation styles, I had the first one with her husband, where it was a lot of arguing, and he had a lot of YouTube videos that really proved his point, he thought. And I had scientific papers, and neither of us were convincing the other of anything. But after he went to bed, I talked to my cousin, who, because I have a better relationship with, I think we started off in more of that constructive cycle that I probably should have known to do myself in the first time. And through like extensively asking her questions and really understanding her point of view, it became clear that like a lot of this is about sort of, you know, in the case of kids, so this was again before COVID vaccines, having control over sort of the healthcare of people's children, and about the fact that our health care policies for children are designed to maximize vaccine uptake. And therefore, kids have to get many shots all at once, even though from a biological perspective, that doesn't need to happen. But we, from a public health perspective, know that if we do it all at once, then it's more likely to get done, right? And so that sort of tension of like, well, yeah, but like I should be able to make some of these decisions myself as a parent of my child. And through that, like had a much more open conversation where we actually did look at some of the research papers and I explained some of the ways that the YouTube videos were skewing the data, et cetera. So anyway, that's a very long example of why in this sort of going forward, or one of the I am losing my train of thought a little, but like one of the challenges in the election was potentially not engaging with communities who we need to talk to, right? And I think to some degree we don't know how to talk to, and this we as both scientists and again my political organizing hat, because that engaging with Congress talk actually started off as a talk for my political activist friends, and then made its way into the scientific community. Now I'm just rambling. I've had a lot of thoughts about what we could do and how we could use our material and our approach to address some of the big issues in society, but it's been mostly shower thoughts at this point and notes, and I'm not sure exactly what we're going to do.
I mean, I know you have the one module, the CRISPR module that's on the website. I wonder if potentially one of the communication module might be helpful and just putting out there.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of the thought with that sort of active listening thing. Actually, turn it back on you all. What do you want? What do you need? What would be helpful in approaching the next 4 years for you all?
Hello, hi. I think for me, it's just like having the information accessible. I'm a science communicator and I know like you're doing science communication and also do civic science. I think that's kind of constantly like the workflow of it. It's like how can we continuously making it accessible for like all types of learnings too. Yes, we reduce the jargon, but to me, when I look at accessibility, it's so many things besides that too. Like how is it portrayed visually? Are you using different alt texts? Are you having different fonts available? Like all these different things. Is it available, with captions? All these different things that can make the information, more accessible. And of course that takes more time, more money, more people, more energy. But I wanted to know, like, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely do all of that, right? To what degree we're successful, I'm happy to have feedback. Our program coordinator at Harvard was really in charge of like, he had a whole sort of checklist of accessibility things that needed to be done whenever we were creating things. So I don't know it off the top of my head, but I do know it was something that we addressed in the creation of our material. But certainly, I would be happy to have feedback from people who know that space better than I, and also with no longer having a program coordinator, it's good to flag that as something that we should stay on top of. And then more broadly with making things accessible in terms of different languages, different audiences, et cetera, like that's really comes down to like a funding issue, right? If we can find funding to do these things, we are very excited to do it. But we are in the early stages of fundraising for the program. Harvard did not let us take our remaining funds over. And so I've been spending most of my time researching and reaching out to potential funders to make sure that we can continue this work.
So I just thought of something when you were saying that. I think also like for the funded is like I was a part of, I think it's like called Montclair, I'm not sure, but I was a part of this review team, and it was basically having journalists paired with like non it was like scientists and then journalists. So you like pair them together, but like where you have a person that has one strength and then another person that have another strength. So you don't have to like reinvent the wheel. So like if
Mm.
you know we don't know all these other languages, but like maybe like partner with someone that speaks that language, because even with translations, things can get lost in translation if that's
Mhm.
not like the
Yeah,
native language. So like making like pairings where it's like a science person and then it's like someone where language is their strength. Like I said, I don't know exactly how that would like pan out, but I
yeah,
think that could be a potential idea.
yeah, for sure.
Are there any final questions or comments for Dan?
Or any thoughts back to the question, like, what do you need or want as we move into some uncertain times for science and science engagement?
Honestly, I mean,
Sorry.
no, you go ahead, Cheyenne. Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting to hear about the work that you're doing there. And I just had a question out of curiosity, really, if you had any feedback from students about the biggest challenge of the course, or maybe there was a concept which you noticed was also just a bit took more time for people to get into.
Hmm. So I'll say the only one I teach is a science policy course. My co-director is the one who teaches them all and will probably have a better answer for you. I think though, like the biggest thing that I sort of witness is, students trying to understand the role that science plays in solving societal issues. I think that, spending 4 to 10 years in the STEM community, being trained through undergrad and grad school, you end up in a very, uh, very much what's it called? Uh, like a bubble. There's a word for it. I'm tired. But basically, everyone around you has similar training and therefore probably has similar values and therefore probably thinks that solutions are obvious when in reality it's only obvious because everybody around you sort of agrees, right? And so like I start my science policy course with having students bring in a recommendation for a policy, and generally everybody agrees with each other's recommendation, but I have them break down like, okay, what is the science that's part of that recommendation, and what are your personal values that you're bringing to make that recommendation? Because you can't ever say I recommend you do something without having a values statement making that. Science can only tell you sort of what is. It can provide data. So the example I use, like, science can show, the probability of cancer as exposure to an evil toxic chemical increases, right? But it can't tell you what the safe level is, right? The safe level depends on sort of society's tolerance for risk, other trade-offs, like using less of this chemical will lead to more health hazards from other substances, et cetera, economic, et cetera. So like, I would say the biggest sort of thing that scientists don't necessarily know coming into this is that kind of role of science in decision making, and they sort of think more about like, oh, science has all the answers. You're going to tell me how to make sure that these answers get used by society, versus having them understand that the answers they think are obvious may not be obvious or even acceptable to other people.
Super interesting. So exiting the echo chamber.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, echo
Very
chamber.
nice.
That's
Okay.
that's like
That's
one
the
of the
word.
words I was
Okay.
looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And with that, we have to end our mentor chat, unfortunately. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dan, for chatting with our community. I really enjoyed it. People in the chat said they enjoyed it, and I'm gonna trust them.
Awesome. And yeah, I'll invite everybody again one last time. If you have thoughts afterwards, in the spirit of making sure that I'm listening to the community on things that, you know, based on what I told you about, like how could we be helpful? Feel free to shoot me an email. I guess I'll put my email in the chat. I don't know if you all already have it. But yes.
And I will share any links or anything else that we talked about in our Slack channel for everyone, and Dan's email as well, so that when you have thoughts and ideas, you can just send them to him. Dan, it might be useful for us to add you to the Psychommerce network, honestly.
Yeah,
easier.
feel free. Is it mostly Slack? I need to figure out how to use Slack. I'm old.
Yeah, it is mostly Slack.
I know that I used it once upon a time, so I need to remember how to do that.
Again, thank you. Everyone, we will be ending the site, well, not ending like forever, but like just for 2024, the last 2024 mentor chat will be December 12th. About narrative storytelling and persuasion and op-eds with Jean Corbin. We'll be sort of continuing this conversation about active communication and how you can use active communication in your written pieces to speak with the public. And so with that, we will end our mentor chat, and thank you.
When is that, and can I go?
Oh, yeah, you can go. I can send you the Zoom link.
Yeah, that'd be great. Cool. It was great to meet everyone.
Bye.
Bye.